All
Die
right.
Hard is a Christmas movie. Ooh.
Forsooth I say unto thee, those who perish difficultly.
I am the ghost of Christmas movies.
Yeah.
And I declare that Die Hard is that we don't need this podcast.
Oh, damn it, Ghost, you ruined this lovely content. On that note, that's what we're going to start with because I thought that was pretty funny. Hi, everybody. My name is Jack Packard.
I'm Darren Mooney.
And on this week's episode, it's going to be a little bit different. We're actually recording this a couple weeks ago, so we don't have to work on Christmas. Don't
spoil the illusion, Jack. I want listeners to know that, like, I've had
sure.
the proper Christmas experience today. Today, like most people, I watched Wonder Woman for the first time. You know, so I'm in the Christmas mindset.
We watched Wonder Woman and we watched Soul, and I'm sure both of them are great because I've already seen them both. Yes.
Perfectly cromulent.
Perfectly cromulent. Embiggen. Cromulent didn't make it into the dictionary, by the way. Embiggen did, though.
No, which cromulent is a much better word.
Oh, it's such a good word.
Cromulent is like
it's a perfectly cromulent word. In any case,
it's self-describing.
It's self-describing.
It's autodidactic, yeah.
So this is a little bit. This will probably be a shorter episode. It's just Darren and I because of some research that I've done, some math that I've worked out for myself. I have come to the conclusion that while Die Hard is a very good action movie, I do not consider it in the Christmas movie genre for several reasons, which I'm sure we'll get into. Darren, of course, thinks that Die Hard is a Christmas movie. And so as part of your post-Christmas hangout and, you know, like get over your Christmas hangover, we're going to talk about Die Hard, a fantastic movie. Maybe not a Christmas movie. So,
yeah, I mean, I feel like Jack really needs kind of like a white coat and like a little board and a pen when he says that he's talked to several scientists and they assure him that Die Hard does not have the ordeal of Christmas cheer necessary for us to certify it as a Christmas movie.
Mm-hmm. So the research that I started to do was just on how genre is labeled on a movie in and of itself. Like what makes an action movie, a romance, a romance. And what I found was that the defining traits of a genre is very wibbly wobbly, if you will. And it's mostly based on similarities to other things within that genre. And so, for example, like an action movie is only considered an action movie because it has action-like elements that are also in other movies that are considered to be action movies. And so, like, definitions change, things are wibbly-wobbly. So what I tried to do was break down what made a Christmas movie, and the two criteria that I came up with was a supermajority of Christmas-like imagery, trees, snows, Santa Claus, like Christmassy characters. A supermajority being 2/3 or 66%. And of course, a Christmas-like morality. Things like, the importance of family, believing in joy or magic or wonder, selflessness, that sort of thing. And if any movie ticked those two boxes, it can be considered a Christmas movie. And that's when, Darren, I discovered something sinister about Die Hard. There is so little Christmas imagery within Die Hard. That's where I'm going to start with. Christmas imagery is, a Christmas movie, in my opinion, has to have Christmas images in it. Trees and snows and Santas and reindeers and Frosties and all those fun things that make lights, blinking lights, that sort of thing. And Die Hard, after literally going through the movie in my editor and timing it out, Die Hard has 11.8% of it Christmas-like imagery. It's just not enough. It's just not enough.
Two quick things. First of all, I agree entirely about the idea of genre being entirely elastic and unquantifiable. I'm very fond of Ursula Le Guin's argument that, it's really not particularly relevant in terms of talking about genre, in terms of breaking things down.
Right.
It's one of those things where you feel it, rather than you know it, Jack. You feel it in
Ooh,
your essence. You can't
yes.
break it down. And you can't argue that, like, genre, it's not rigidly defined. Like, again, we have arguments all the time. Is it a horror movie? Every time that, like, a movie that has a scary moment in it wins or gets nominated for Best Picture, there's the, but is it really a horror movie argument? And the argument is, and again, it's a fun argument that we always have.
Yeah.
And it's a fun argument because the answer is always yes, but it's fun to talk about anyway. If you can argue that it's a horror movie, it probably is a horror movie. But more to the point, what I think is kind of interesting there, with your little scientician jacket on and your little clipboard with all your statistics and data on there.
Wrote it all
Yeah.
down.
Yeah, I know. I like that you include lots of fact and figures, because they prove everything. I mean, 4/5 of people know that, right? But I mean, but like, I do find myself kind of nervous about the way in which we talk about film. And again, this is a very broad point before we start talking about Die Hard in particular.
Of course.
One of the big issues that I have with a lot of modern film discourse and discussion is the attempt to make it objective, and the attempt to make it like something that you can quantify and measure. And I'd argue that you can trace that down to things like the emergence of Rotten Tomatoes or Metacritic, which attempt to assign a score or value to a movie that is based on a collection or aggregation of other data. And again, you could go back and you could say, well, that's down to giving them stars in reviews, because that attempts to say that this is 75% of a good movie. You could even go back to Ebert, who popularized the thumbs up and thumbs down, and say, well, that reduces it to a binary where it's good or it's bad, where it's, either in the 50% of good movies, the 50% of bad movies. And I'm wary of that, as I think that those obviously have their uses in terms of very quickly looking at things and trying to determine, is this a movie I'd stick on at Christmas? And we'll come back to that. But I do think that, like, in terms of defining genre and quality, it's more interesting, I think, to talk it out. However, Jack,
yes,
because you broached the question and the idea of statistics, I think that it is very important to note that if we are quantifying Die Hard as a Christmas movie, and I think that you're right, how you define genre is often in relation to other movies. You kind of correlate them. You say, is it more scary than other things? Does it share certain elements with movies that we unequivocally agree to be horror movies? Therefore, it is drawing from horror cinema and can be quantified as such. Does it borrow imagery and iconography that we associate with the Westerns, even if it's set in the present day, or it's not set in America, or it's set in the East? It can still be a Western, even though it normally defies...
Something like Rian Johnson's Brick is very clearly a noir, even though it's not in the noir settings. Absolutely.
Even though it's shot in color and set in a high school. Yeah,
exactly. But it shares enough points. I'm with you.
Yeah, in terms of correlating and mapping this out. What I would say then, if we are going to go down this path and you want a statistical argument, my big statistical argument is this. Die Hard contains no fewer than 4 Christmas songs featured heavily on the soundtrack. Now, going back through IMDb and pulling out all the data, I didn't do this because I have a life, Jack, but the wonderful Stephen Follows, who is very good at drawing out movie data, went back and said, well, okay, how many songs does a regular movie contain? How many Christmas songs does a regular movie contain? How many Christmas songs does a movie typically set at Christmas contain? And through that, he correlated that apparently 99.2% of movies have fewer Christmas songs than Die Hard. Die Hard is statistically more Christmassy than 99.2% of movies. Now, if you were to screen a movie every day of the year by its relationship to Christmas as a holiday, you would only have the option of screening Die Hard on either Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, or St. Stephen's Day. And that's at a push. You'd have to screen it late on Christmas Eve, or early on kind of St. Stephen's Day.
I don't know what St. Stephen's Day is.
Oh, the day after Christmas. I think British people call it Boxing Day. I don't know what Americans call it.
I know Boxing Day.
The day that we're releasing this.
Yes.
Okay, Boxing Day.
Boxing Day is one I know.
That's a separate debate about Boxing Day and St. Stephen's Day. Boxing Day is because servants used to get their presents on Boxing Day, because it was the day after Christmas. Cool. And because in Ireland we typically didn't have servants and typically were servants, we don't tend to like using that definition of it.
That's absolutely fair.
that's a very separate point for discussion. But my argument is, though, yes. So if you it's only 0.8% of movies are more Christmassy than Die Hard.
Okay.
So 356 days in a year, 365 days in a year, you could only screen it on 3 of those days. Those 3 days would have to be the ones closest to Christmas. It's a Christmas movie.
I guess just because it is more Christmas-like than other movies does not necessarily make it a Christmas movie. I like the reason why I settled on this super majority number, this 2/3% Christmas imagery, and songs are included in that. Those like whether something is a Christmas song is of course very wibbly wobbly as well, like Canon in D. That's used in a lot of Christmas movies, but it's also a wedding song. So it's like, right? So, what my thought was on this was if you saw a movie on in a store. So a little bit of backstory. For many, many years when I was younger, I worked at a used video and video game store. Fantastic job. Got to watch movies and play video games all day while no customers were in there. And during the holiday season, of course, we were only allowed to watch Christmas movies. So I saw Jingle All the Way so many times. Fantastic film. So my thought was if you were in a store and you happened to look at a random section of a random movie, would you see Christmas-like imagery and therefore it be a Christmas movie? That's where I started to think about it. You happen to watch a movie, is it Christmassy? Are you more likely than not to see Christmas imagery? Does that count? So something like the Santa Claus, obviously.
Where he's wearing a red suit and has a beard all throughout. Yeah, that
On a Christmas. Elf, of course, very Christmassy characters. These sort of things. Miracle on 34th Street. Will you see Christmas-like imagery more often than you would not? And in Die Hard, you will almost never see Christmas-type imagery.
But Jack, I would counter that argument and I would say that movies are not designed to be broken down and to be separated from a context. They are designed to be viewed as a whole. This is not Quibi, Jack. We are not living in Quibi's world. Well, I would argue in terms of imagery as well. Like, I know that we disagree on the idea of using quantifiable metrics to measure these things, but let's face it, I'm not above using them if they suit my argument in particular. I'm not saying I'm a massive hypocrite, Jack, but I am saying that I'm willing to take advantage of the system when it suits my means and benefits.
There we go.
As somebody who has measured and quantified this stuff, would you say that the majority of the Christmas imagery is weighted towards the back end of the film? In particular, the longest stretches of the Christmas imagery or the Christmas sounds or the aspects of the movie that make it Christmassy. So, for example, snow falling possibly, or red lights blinking in the background, or a bearded man flying through the sky. Are those elements all kind of like concentrated towards one end of the film in particular? And is it more where the film ends up rather than where it starts?
The beginning of the film is more traditionally Christmassy. Obviously, Die Hard takes place on Christmas Eve at a holiday Christmas party. So the beginning of the film is where we see the big Christmas tree. We see presents. We see like a tree and presents in the lobby.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Stuff like that. I've gone through the entire film and I found like little things like a gunfight near the second, third act break. Where there's a tiny Christmas tree on a desk that gets shot over. There's a Santa Claus, just like, in the background still counts because, it's a Christmas thing in the scene. As we get towards the end, the Christmassy setting gets a little more metaphorical. So, like, I do count the entire end sequence where all the paper is falling, very much like snowfall.
While it sings "Let It Snow," in case you don't get what they're doing here.
Exactly. I count that entire sequence
theme
as being Christmas-like. And stuff like a bearded man flying through the sky, that's weak. That's paper thin, if I do say so myself.
Would you say Barabon thin, huh?
Zingy. I know we have talked in the past just a little bit about our back and forth with this, and I know that metaphorically you can look on some images in Die Hard as being Christmas-like, but I'm gonna call that way wibbly wobbly.
I like this. I like the kind of gradient scale that we have for genre. Genre is inherently wibbly wobbly, but then
Yes.
when we get to talking about it abstractly, it's way wibbly wobbly.
It's like incredibly wibbly wobbly, if you will. And so, like, something like a bearded German going, flying through the sky is like, yeah, you can assign that to
I
Santa
mean,
Claus.
are you talking about Kris Kringle, perhaps? The origin of the modern American Santa Claus, who is a German bearded figure? Or are you
Eh,
talking about Hans Gruber? I mean, I can't really tell the two apart.
that to me, it's like, if you want to call that Christmas imagery, I'm gonna have to call you out on that, because there is, unless he was wearing a red suit while doing so, that does not count.
Absolutely counts. He's flying through the sky. His big plan hinges on the rooftop. In fact, John McClane blows up the rooftop because that's core to Hans Gruber's plan. Who else has a plan that hinges on the rooftop and getting gifts into and out of via the rooftop? That's a question for you, Jack.
My roofer, I guess. You know. Um,
But no, okay. If we want to talk about imagery, I
yeah.
would argue that like Christmas imagery is obviously inherently subjective and it's
Mhm.
incredibly broad. And there's a lot of reasons why, culturally speaking, it is incredibly broad. And a large
Mm.
part of that is due to the discussion about, and again, I don't want to get into this on the podcast because I don't think it's an actual discussion, but it is something that plays out in the media every single year, which is the degree to which Christmas is a religious or a secular holiday. I
Mhm.
think that it's both, and I don't think it's a problem that it's both. And
I'm with
what
you.
I would,
Yeah.
yeah, and what I would argue is that what you get with Die Hard is you get a lot of imagery that is divorced from context, but which again suggests this idea of a broad idea of Christmas. So you
Mhm.
have, for example, the Christmas party, which involves a pregnant woman she doesn't go into labor during the Christmas party, but she's very much there in an unconventional setting for a pregnant woman to be. You have things like the canted angle on the red lights, which again very much remind me of like strong Christmas lighting, the use of the color red. Even arguably the canted angles, which are more heightened and kind of stylized and seem more kind of surreal and kind of more what I associate with the sugar rush of Christmas than what happens later on. You have John McClane using like a little sort of sellotape gun, which is similar to what you use to seal parcels, which I associate to Christmas, to wrap his own Christmas surprise at the climax to ambush Hans Gruber. You have, again, the imagery. We mentioned the importance of the rooftop throughout the film. This is a film that is set in a skyscraper. Therefore, height is important, but also the fact that so much of it takes place on the roof, which we associate with where Santa Claus comes into the building, but also the ventilation shaft imagery. The idea of John McClane, and anybody who has ever talked to an architect about the Die Hard movies will tell you that the idea of John McClane navigating the skyscraper through the air ducts is precisely as plausible as an overweight German gentleman helping himself into your sitting room by basically sneaking down your chimney. But you have this idea of kind of like the ventilation shaft, which he can maneuver through, the idea of like fans, and the idea of kind of this getting into and out of the building through mechanisms that are not conventionally designed for human beings to travel through.
So
Even
are you saying that John McClane is coming down the chimney tonight? Is that what you're getting at here?
Well, I mean, okay, this is a separate discussion about theme, because I think one of the interesting things about Die Hard is how it shifts over the course. There's a weird power play that works
Uh-huh.
through Die Hard, where initially Gruber is the Santa Claus character and John McClane is the Grinch, and
Mhm.
then when John McClane learns the true meaning of Christmas, the switch flips, and John McClane is suddenly Santa. Hans Gruber is the Gremlin or the Grinch, and they have to save Christmas from each other, and it's remarkable. But that's an issue of
Okay,
theme
no,
rather
that's
than
fair.
imagery. So let's leave that aside for the
Well,
moment.
but I like, to me, like, I'm just, we're gonna put a pin in it obviously for later, but I'm plucking it right now just to say, like, all of these things you're talking about are very abstract Christmas imagery.
I mean, it's a set at Christmas. Like I don't feel like having discussions about how it's set at Christmas, how he's coming back for Christmas, how he has a giant wrapped toy for his child, how the hostage situation takes place at Christmas, how all that is abstract. And then when you have that, you have a level of gravity, and all the other stuff tends to get drawn towards it. It's very similar to what you talked about when you talked about Brick, which is Brick is a movie that takes place in a high school,
Mhm.
but it builds critical mass by building up these tropes that you associate with film noir and detective stories, so that eventually, like, everything becomes recontextualized and re-understood through that lens. So, like, you have a movie that primes you, he's coming home for Christmas, there's the question of whether or not he's going to get to stay there for Christmas, you have the use of Christmas music, you have the wrapped teddy bear, you have the gigantic Christmas tree, you have, like, even the discussion about the idea of Christmas in Japan that comes up, which is very popular in 80s pop culture, and again, a weird wormhole that we can probably go down later on in this podcast or discussion that is merits its own attention. But, like, you have this kind of critical mass of stuff that builds to the point where even the smaller stuff ends up getting caught in the gravity and kind of sucked into it and becoming part of this larger Christmas mythos. And I'm talking about things like, for example, the emphasis the movie places on lists, where initially Hans Gruber has a list of boys and girls that he wants to see sent home for Christmas. He read about them in Time magazine, for example. You have John McClane, and again, this ties into this theme that I mentioned of John McClane wresting control of the narrative back from Hans. Hans initially seems like a Christmassy character. He's introduced, he's reading a little, like, black book, like a Bible, he's preaching like a sermon, he's standing there in front of the Christmas tree, it's very solemn, it's very dignified, it's very quiet, it's a very traditional, old-fashioned view of what Christmas is, and then John McClane just comes in and he starts lighting all this stuff off. But McClane, you'll note, when he starts taking control of the situation, makes a list of the terrorists. That is one of the ways that he does it, and he even checks it twice. He has various question marks. He figures out how they relate to one another. Again, very much tied to the idea of Christmas imagery. And again, I would argue that yes, along those lines, the ventilation shafts are essentially part of that. Because again, the most Christmassy of Christmassy image is the idea of somebody coming into your house who doesn't belong there through an air vent that is far, far, far too small to allow a person entry into that space.
I understand your argument here about, like, the greater context. And I know, like, this has been backed up by the writer of Die Hard saying that, you know, these elements were specifically put in there as part of Christmas things.
We should talk about that. We should talk about why they're put in there, because I think this is fascinating. So yes, Die Hard, to be clear, not released at Christmas. The original Die Hard was not released in Christmas. I believe it was released in July, right?
Yes, it was a summer blockbuster.
Summer blockbuster, just put that in there. Now, to be clear, that is not a concession on my point. There's a long and rich history of movies that have been released in summer that have been accepted as Christmas classics. I would go back and I would say, you cited it yourself, Jack. The Miracle on 34th Street, originally released in August, I believe 1947, but is widely considered a Christmas movie. Now, you might say, that just happens to be because it stars Santa Claus. I might say it's because Christmas transcends the idea of December. But we'll agree, we'll put a pin in that and come back to it later. But things like, say, the success of, like, Lethal Weapon, which was set at Christmas, movies like, say, Batman Returns, which is the weirdest, horniest, loneliest Christmas blockbuster that was ever released in the middle of, June 1992, for example. This sort of, like, range, Trading Places was a summer blockbuster as well, and again is set at Christmas. And again, you know, and I think that there's something very interesting in that. The reason that Die Hard is set at Christmas is in part because the novel that it's based on, and I love the fact that Die Hard was based on a novel. I really love the idea of it as a great literary adaptation. Also, my favorite fun fact of that is that, like, it was based on a novel that was a sequel to an earlier novel that was adapted as a Frank Sinatra film. So they had to, this is great. Frank Sinatra. Is
this really true?
This is really true. Frank Sinatra, I think it's a Richard Chance novel, basically. But I think that basically Frank Sinatra owned the rights to Richard Chance. So they had to go to 76-year-old Frank Sinatra and ask him, would you like to play John McClane in this movie that we're making? Would you like to be the hero in this movie that we're making? And he had to take a look at the script and say, no, I pass, before they could go and cast, like, sort of Bruce Willis. Tell me that you don't want a Frank Sinatra version of Die Hard, where he's just crawling through at the age of 76.
Elderly crooner Frank Sinatra saying, yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker, I am there.
But anyway, so like so many of the decisions around Die Hard, the Christmas setting came from the book, right? But it was apparently really pushed by Joel Silver, who is, again, a separate podcast unto himself, a Hollywood legend. Barbara Streisand's hairdresser turned boyfriend / the basis of the character Chris Christopherson played in the 1970 odd remake of A Star is Born. Fascinating character. And again, Kevin Smith's stories of dealing with him on the, like, Rejected Superman Lives pitch are amazing, as are his involvement in Wild Wild West. I kind of want to know if he ever wanted to include a giant spider in Die Hard. I haven't read anything to support that assertion whatsoever, but part of me thinks that
he was building up. He was working up to that.
He was amping up at that point. But the thing about Silver is he apparently he looked at Lethal Weapon, which he'd produced the previous year, and it had been a summer movie that was set at Christmas, and it had been a massive commercial success. And he had found that it had been licensed very successfully at Christmas. Because, Jack, and hear me out here, when your movie is set at Christmas, it tends to be associated with the holiday. In fact, you might argue that it becomes something of a Christmas movie, and tends to be aired at Christmas, therefore generating nice residual checks for Silver, and he would argue that every year, as these movies became Christmas movies in the way that we conventionally associate Christmas movies becoming, through the process of repetition, that they would gain lots of checks through it. So the writer was told, yeah, don't worry about the fact that we're releasing this in summer. Make it as Christmassy as you want. Now, admittedly, you could argue that Joel Silver had forgotten the true meaning of Christmas in that he really wanted those sweet, sweet residual checks. Or you could argue that he simply embraced the commercial spirit of the modern holiday to its literal extreme. There's a bit of push and pull there, really.
I think Charlie Brown would have a lot to say about this, is I guess what I'm saying. You know, and it's true. So the other thing about genre, and all my reading and research about what makes a genre is authorial intent, right? Authorial. I don't know how to say that. Uh, the intent of the person creating the media has something to do with the genre that media is. And so if the intention was release it in summer so that it hits TV and home video by the time it's Christmas, that's incredibly cynical, but does lead to it being more well considered a Christmas movie. Maybe just a bad Christmas movie. A very good action.
That's a hell of an escalation, Jack.
A very good action movie, but a bad Christmas movie, right?
Okay, well, let's okay. Authorial intent is highly questionable here. Let's be honest, because if authorial intent mattered, I think that we would all be talking about Tommy Wiseau's The Room as the great American character drama instead of the camp classic that we accept it as today.
But that's okay. A small aside here. That's what makes it the great American camp classic, is because his authorial intent was to make a character drama.
Yes, but it exists separately. The movie that Tommy Wiseau made is not the movie that Tommy Wiseau wanted to make. The movie that you and I watch and appreciate, and I'm going to talk for both of us here, dearly, dearly love. Dearly love. Is not the movie that Tommy Wiseau thought he was making, despite the fact that he may have, in recent years, attempted to reclaim it as such. I think that, authorial intent is a factor to consider here, but it is not the only thing. I think that, movies and stories and media exist outside the lives of their writers. I would argue that, for example, To Kill a Mockingbird, you don't have to read To Kill a Mockingbird through the lens of Go Set a Watchman. If you didn't like the treatment of Atticus Finch in Go Set a Watchman, which was written by Harper Lee, now admittedly published by her relatives after her passing, and, sort of implicitly not something that she ever wanted to see published, so highly ethically questionable anyway, but let's assume that Harper Lee wrote it and she intended for it to be canon, as it were. You as an audience member do not have to accept that. You as an audience member do not have to go back and reread To Kill a Mockingbird and think Atticus Finch is going to become a massive racist afterwards. You could just read it and go, Atticus Finch, he's pretty cool. I like this Atticus Finch guy. That is up to you, and that is up to... And I think that it happens kind of culturally. And again, this is the thing where TV and the idea of repetition and the idea of acceptance comes in, right? Because, things that were not intended to serve original purposes. And I think we've established that Die Hard, cynically was maybe intended to serve this particular purpose. But let's throw away the cynicism aside, the spirit of the season, whatever. That's some nonsense, Whatever gets Joel Silver paid, I don't think he really minds. But my argument would be that through repetition, it becomes a Christmas movie in the same way that movies like, say, The Wizard of Oz arguably become a Christmas movie because they are aired.
Really?
Traditionally, they're considered Christmas movies. They're aired on, I think CBS has been airing it.
I've never heard that.
Okay. It's a Wonderful Life, for example, bombed at the box office, but was saved by airing at Christmas consistently on American television.
Because it was incredibly cheap. Much like a Christmas Story, which bombed, and then it was so cheap, someone said, oh, we'll just buy up the rights and air it. To before we get too far off of The Room point here.
And back to the center argument. Yeah, I love that. Back to the focal point of this argument.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, I'm moving you back to The Room so we can move back to Die Hard here. Authorial intent is a piece of the puzzle. Of course, I as a certifiable arty farty fuck, I also believe that authorial intent has nothing to do with audience reception. Two separate things, right? if you were to ask someone what genre The Room was, they would not say a campy comedy. They would say it's a drama. It's a drama character study. It's just so bad that we perceive it as campy. The genre of The Room does not change because of our perception or the quality in there of the room. No one would call The Room a comedy. It is a comedy, but that's not what the genre of The Room is.
I think to be fair, many people would say maybe it tries to be a drama and it succeeds at being a comedy, which is an acknowledgement of how elastic this idea of genre is,
Yes.
and how
Which is why
Oh, here
which
we
is
go.
why Die Hard is a bad Christmas movie, but a good action movie, just like The Room is a bad drama, but a good
Whoa,
comedy.
whoa! Oh, I love that. I
You're
love that.
welcome.
I love that my entire point was like authorial intent doesn't matter, but it proves my case anyway. And your argument was authorial intent proves your case, but authorial intent doesn't matter. Boom, score. It was, it's like, you can't take my tangent and and then prove that it invalidates my whole argument.
I can and I did.
I love that in the spirit of the season. The prosecution rests, Your Honor.
I've made my case. Oh, I haven't? Oh, crap. Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, okay. I feel like as the person here who is making the argument for it as a Christmas movie, the onus is very much on me to do that. And again, I know that the problem with this is that a lot of it is very nebulous, in that I know for a fact that every Christmas from, I think, 2004 onwards, the entire extended Mooney family has sat down and watched at least 2 Die Hard movies at Christmas. Typically Die Hard 1 and Die Hard 3, even though Die Hard 3 is not a Christmas movie. But we just like Die Hard 1 and we're like, let's continue on. Die Hard 2 is actually set at Christmas, but it's less good, so we skipped that one. And we watched Die Hard 4 one year and we're like, let's not do that again. And then we did Die Hard 5 and we're like, no, never. There are 3 Die Hards, so we're happy with that. But
Okay, yeah, I could be with you there.
But yeah, and again, it everybody will have their own separate Christmas movies. I personally would consider actually Batman Returns to be one of my formative Christmas movies. It's the Christmas movie that I kind of get really emo and moody and wrap my presents by myself to, because it's the lonely at Christmas movie. And then I go downstairs and with everybody else it's great. But I mean, otherwise I'm upstairs moody as hell, just sitting there watching Batman Returns, and it's like, this is what it's like to be alone at Christmas. I don't know why I did the Christian Bale Batman accent, but you get what I'm saying there. And obviously, so you are making an argument for a Christmas movie. It is inherently subjective. It's inherently, you're going to ask 10 people to name 10 Christmas movies, and I suspect that outside of perennial classic like It's a Wonderful Life, you will get a surprising variety in terms of movies that they answer. I know people who sit down and watch LA Confidential as a Christmas movie every year. And I'm really happy for them because it's a great movie, but it's not a movie I want to watch at Christmas. But again, this idea of kind of defining genre and defining mood, and the idea that it is elastic, which suits both of our points, because you can argue that it's so elastic you can just shimmy it a little bit to the left. And therefore avoid Die Hard. I'm arguing it's so elastic, you just nudge it a little bit to the right, and oh, look, Die Hard's in there. It's a Christmas movie.
Right.
So I admit that we are being a bit kind of specious, and again, it's arguably a completely irrelevant debate, but that's the fun of it. It's Christmas. Come on, let us have it.
Exactly. Like the entire point of it is we're not going to be mad at each other after this. We're having a conversation to help our listeners be more pedantic and unbearable at Christmas parties.
Yeah.
Right.
And also hopefully to convince them to stick on Die Hard at Christmas, because it's a Christmas movie.
A fantastic movie. Listen, if you want to watch the Jurassic Park at Christmas and make that your Christmas movie, do it. It's a fantastic film. You want to watch, The Fifth Element because it's really about the spirit of love and togetherness. You do that. It's another fantastic film. It doesn't matter. Nothing matters. We're just doing this
in the true spirit
we're just
of
doing
the
this for
season.
yucks over here, Darren. Let's rein this in and start talking about the themes of Die Hard, because that's the other part of my formula here is Christmas-like themes: selflessness, togetherness with family, believing in magic, the classic Christmas themes.
Yeah.
And here's what I will say to Die Hard is they do not. Die Hard's a great movie. Remember this. Remember this, everyone listening to this, because they're gonna get mad at me in a second. Die Hard is a great movie and I love it.
But
but they don't show their math as far as John McClane's character arc. In fact,
Counterpoint, Jack. Didn't we just hold on? Before we do this, right? In terms of showing math, didn't we literally just sit down a couple of weeks ago and talk about how A Christmas Prince is the perfect Netflix Christmas movie, despite the fact that it maybe doesn't necessarily show its math in literally anything that it does?
it it shows its math where it's very simple math. The Christmas Prince is very simple math, but I would argue it does show its math. It shows like where the
Okay.
character started from, what you add, what you subtract to get, the character arc fulfilled.
Okay.
I would argue that in Die Hard, John McClane has no character arc. He is essentially the same person from the beginning of the movie to the end of the movie. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but the movie treats it like he has a character arc.
Okay.
Uh, yeah.
So I'll kind of feel this one, and I'll walk into the trap because I get the sense that there's a trap being laid here because the response to what you've just said is very obvious and very apparent, and I suspect that there are like very Ewoks kind of sharpening sticks either side of me ready to pounce when I do this. So I apologize in advance, listeners, as I walk into Jack's clever ambush. But anyway, what I would say is
So,
John McClane's arc is fairly straightforward. He begins as somebody who is very, very far removed from the idea of Christmas. He is apart from his family at Christmas. He is traveling to a strange land at Christmas. In fact, a lot of the imagery in the first half of the movie is designed to be deliberately uncanny from his perspective. The sound of sleigh bells over the sunset in Los Angeles. Run DMC performing a Christmas song, Christmas in Hollis, which does not sound like a Christmas song to him. He, in fact, says as much to Argyle. The fact that as you're hearing this, he's staring at the sunset over Los Angeles, looking at palm trees rather than Christmas trees, for example.
Absolutely.
The fact that he's so alienated, he's so disconnected, he has to take off his shoes and literally ground himself. He doesn't know where he is staying that night. The fact that the only snow that's visible is on sort of Ellis's nose. The fact that, like, even before that, Holly has had to literally explain to Ellis the meaning of Christmas in order to underscore how little of that meaning has actually permeated the party that they're operating at the moment. McClane is out of his element. He's very, he walks up to the party, he gets kissed on the cheek because it's California, and I guess they're more liberal out there. It's very disorienting. It's very out of place.
Yes.
He walks up to the Japanese guy and he's like, I hear you guys celebrate Christmas now? And then Tagaki's like, yeah, we do. We're very accommodating like that. Which again has kind of that low-key whiff of kind of like 1980s Hollywood being like, those Japanese, they're financially successful. And we're kind of a little uncomfortable with that. That you see like permeating movies like, say, for example, like Blade Runner or Black Rain, or even like in the 90s, was it The Rising Sun with the wonderful Sean Connery and Wesley Snipes as well. So you like that's sort of like all permeating there, and I think like a large part of that Japanese phobia was also tied up in the idea of them appropriating American iconography and imagery, and part of that was Christmas imagery. And again, there's a lot of interesting, and I say interesting when I really mean vaguely racist, but urban legends about like the use of celebration of Christmas in Japan. In the 90s, there were these stories about like murals that would show Santa Claus crucified on the cross in Japanese shopping centers, for example, which I believe have no basis in fact, and say more about how Americans perceive Japan than they did about Japan itself, to be absolutely clear.
Sure.
But the whole point of all this is to suggest that John McClane is alienated from the Christmas that he is experiencing. This is not the Christmas that he wants. And he goes into like a working class cop, like wearing sort of very, casual clothes, shows up to a fancy Christmas party. They're playing classical music on the soundtrack. He's getting kissed by men left, right, and center. It's, it's not his place. It's not where he belongs. And again, so he feels separate from Christmas. He feels separate from the holiday. He feels separate from his family. And then, over the course of the movie, now you argue that he doesn't have an arc. I would argue that he very clearly has an arc. He reconciles with his wife, and this is where it gets absolutely crucial. The big scene, emotionally speaking, in Die Hard is not any of the confrontations between McClane and Gruber, although they are fantastic, in large part because Willis and Rickman play off each other very, very well. The key scene emotionally is the moment when he's talking on the radio to his cop buddy downstairs.
Right.
And he's talking about his wife, and he's saying, look, you I can't tell you her name right now because obviously we're being listened to at the moment. So you are again going to have to check a list and maybe check it twice to figure out who she is. And don't know, just throw that in there. But like, so he's like, she heard me say I love her 1,000 times, but she never once heard me say I was sorry. And that's the moment that he grows as a character. That's the moment at which he learns that he maybe needs to be less like guarded and conservative and less afraid of his wife
Mhm.
spreading her wings, less terrified by the idea that his family is changing. And by the way, again, key theme of Christmas movies, the passage of time, because we mark Christmas once a year, and particularly the
Mhm.
passage of time for families. In many cases, Christmas movies are coming of age stories, in large part about children realizing whether they do or don't need their parents, but also realizing that they're self sufficient. The Home Alone movies are a great example of this, for example. And I mean,
Perfect. Yeah.
what is Die Hard but Home Alone in a skyscraper with John McClane in the role of, sort of like
Ooh, yeah, I like
yeah,
it.
whatever, Kevin McAllister. But anyway, but my argument, though, to bring it back, is that
Yeah.
Die Hard takes that theme and applies it from the opposite perspective. Instead of being a child watching the passage of time at Christmas, the year on year on year on year on year thing, it's McClane realizing that his family has fundamentally changed and understanding that he himself needs to change with them and accept the way that things are now. At the start, Argyle says very simply, look, your wife got a job out here in Los Angeles. You stayed in New York because you figured she'd get tired and she'd come back to you, right?
Mhm.
She'd
Right.
just give up her job. And instead, she's gone and she's prospered and she's successful and she's loved there. I mean, again, Ellis is snorting cocaine, but he's like, look at the Rolex that she's wearing. Again, that materialist idea of Christmas. And we'll talk about materialism later on because that's very relevant to the character of Gruber. But this
Mhm.
idea that kind of runs through where McClane has to accept that Holly belongs here, that Holly is allowed to live here, that Holly is allowed to have a life outside of himself, and that he's not stuck in this idea of 1950s gender norms. So
And
he says I'm sorry. He actually said, and he says I'm sorry on
mm,
the radio. And after that, he can tear through as many terrorists as he wants. Everything after that is just set dressing. He's completed the Christmas journey. He's completed the arc. He gets to go home with his wife. He doesn't
mhm.
have to go to the hotel with Argyle. He doesn't have to sleep in the limo. Holly takes him
Here's
home.
here's the thing,
Her
Darren.
name is Holly, by the way.
Her name is Holly. Yes. Yes. What led to that? Fantastic scene, by the way. John McClane's feet are all full of glass. He's like picking, the glass out of his feet, having a fantastic conversation. His whole like radio relationship with Carl Winslow, who I know that's not his real name, but the father from Family Matters, um, is fantastic. What led up to that realization for John McClane?
Hardship and suffering, the same way that it leads to for everybody. We all endure suffering, Jack. We all
There,
literally, we all literally walk through glass. I mean, there's literally a moment earlier on where he has to confront Gruber and he's like up at the top and he has to change his own name, which is a nice mirroring, by the way, of Holly using her own maiden name. It's like, oh, I understand. I'm in this skyscraper now. I'm in this hostile environment. McClane is
mhm.
basically going through Holly's journey, which is going into this highly corporate glass skyscraper environment, this very alien, very hostile environment, and basically having to navigate it himself while being out of his element. And Holly herself has moved to the other side of the country. So, like, you have the moment where
That's
he's complaining.
tenuous.
He's
That's
complaining that
tenuous.
Holly changed her name, and then kind of later
Yes.
on he has to use the billboard with the names to figure out who Gruber is and who Gruber is pretending to be, while also pretending himself to be somebody else. It's again, he goes through what she goes through, albeit in a, again, like most Christmas movies, a metaphorical version of her journey.
Well.
It's very, very clear. Like, it's very clear when you look at it that, like, Ellis has, it makes it very clear that, like, this has been hard for Holly. Holly, navigating this environment, she's succeeded and she's
Hmm.
thrived. But let's face it, people like Ellis are not making it easy for her. And she's very much under stress, and McClane does not have any sympathy for it. By the way, it's worth noting, by the way, Ellis has a beard. The only other major character who has a beard is Gruber. I'm just throwing those two comparisons out there.
That's
In
probably
terms of,
just
like,
80s. Beards were big in the 80s.
yeah,
Let's
and
just
then,
face
like,
it.
nothing says 80s jerk like beard, to be clear.
This is
Yeah,
the thing.
but
The one John during the scene with Hans, John does not pick a different name.
no, he doesn't pick a different name. He just pretends to be somebody else.
John doesn't.
He
Hans
says he
does.
got John does. John says he got the wrong invite. He's not relating to anybody at the party. He has to
Oh
disavow his
yeah,
wife in the
yeah,
same
but
way that
that
Holly disavows him. The same way
but
that
that's
Holly says they don't respect me here if I'm a married woman. It's a culture thing. I have to pretend not to be married in order to be taken seriously.
yeah, but
McClane has to.
that's not a name thing. That's there's no that's a connection that you're making that is not in the movie.
All
Is
right,
I
all
guess
right, all
what
right. I'm just saying. So
that would be my argument. Is there's no like there's no one to one like there is no scene that mirrors in my opinion
then,
there is no scene on the action side of things that mirrors what he is going through on the personal relationship side of thing. as a fantastic example, one of, in my opinion, the best Marvel action movies is Iron Man 3 because they do such a good job of theming all of the action sequences with what the character is going through. As an example,
Yeah.
one of my favorite MCU movies is Iron Man 3 because they do such a good job of theming all of the action sequences with the character arc. Of course, Tony Stark is figuring out whether or not he's the hero or the suit is the hero. So we have that extended, wonderful action sequence where he builds a bunch of gadgets because he doesn't have the suit to break in, and realizing that it's him, the inventor, is the hero, not just the suit. That's great theming action with the character arc. In Die Hard, I don't think there is that theming. Is my
I mean,
is my bigger point.
there's a lot of mirroring in terms of things like family. So Carl's fixation on like avenging his brother, for example, because this is a Christmas movie that is about family. Things like John McClane arguably being on uncertain ground or uncomfortable ground, which is mirrored, as you pointed out, in the scenes of him like running across glass and literally picking it out of his feet, in order to underscore the idea that he is literally on uncomfortable ground. Oh, okay, fine. Not washing with Jack.
That's loose. That's loose. Like, again, of course, a lot of this is up to our interpretation,
Yeah.
and audience interpretation is just as good as authorial intent. So it's like, yeah, but it's loose, is I guess all I'm saying.
I think the fact that he does this in the office where his wife is working is very important as well. The fact that like he saves the staff where his wife is working, even as he dismantles or helps contribute to the dismantling of the office itself. Although, being honest, they were going to detonate the explosives anyway and blow up the office anyway, so that's not John's fault, to be clear. But like, John does help save all of the people with whom Holly works, which is logically an extension of his accepting her job, her work here. He literally saves her office. Like, I mean,
but the big, like, I'm a big fan of visual metaphors here. So let's get to this, as you mentioned.
We do also have a very clear visual. Sorry, I didn't mean to point so accusatorily. Apologies for that. Let's go for the Hitchcock like vertigo effect. But no, what I was suggesting was you do get a nice visual mirroring later on, where you have the sequence where John swings off the roof with the hose tied around himself, and then the hose, basically the mechanism holding the hose, falls off, and he almost gets pulled off the building by it, and he's only able to escape by untangling it and basically allowing it to drop. That is neatly mirrored at the climax of the film, where Holly is gripping, where Hans is gripping onto Holly, holding on to the watch that she got as a material gift. To be clear, a material gift, because this is a very anti-materialist movie at the climax. And much like John unwraps the hose around himself in order to let the kind of reel fall to its doom, he unlocks the watch around Holly's wrist, and she sheds the metaphorical weight that is Gruber, and all is good in the world. And you get this nice mirroring between the two in terms of action, I would argue.
But that watch, as you stated earlier, is literally the symbol of her achievement at work. So John saves the day by ripping off the symbol of her independent achievement.
Which is gripped by a kind of a German terrorist, I feel. I feel like letting go of the materialist trappings is kind of important here in terms of context.
At the beginning of the movie, like, that watch is pointed out as like, hey, that watch means that she has made it by herself. That watch is important to her as a business person, and getting rid of that watch is what saves the day.
Okay, what I would say, two things I would say about the watch. The person who points to the watch is neither Holly herself, who would obviously be the hero in this case, nor is it Tagaki, who is presented throughout as a reasonable person. Again, he's presented as somebody who is very honorable and very decent and fundamentally a good guy. He won't let Gruber intimidate his men. Instead, the guy who points to the watch and says, "See how important your wife is at this business? And by the way, I am probably trying to bone her as well." That's Ellis. That's Mr. Cocaine and Coke. I feel like shedding what he sees as a status symbol at this office, as opposed to something that, say, Tagaki and Holly see as being important in her role in the business, is important. I think that there's maybe a difference to distinguish there. And particularly the fact that Ellis points to the because he points out how expensive it is as well. It's not that to Ellis, that isn't important because it symbolizes that she's part of the family. It's important because it's worth money, and they spent money on it. And money is what this is really about. And by the way, to be clear, in case you don't get the idea that's kind of running through this, Gruber falls to his death when surrounded by the barabons, which are falling like snow, which again is a
Mm-hmm.
rejection of the materialist trappings of Christmas. So I'm a little hesitant to embrace the idea that the watch is like an independent representation of like Holly as a working woman, and I'm more inclined to believe that it is perhaps an expression of an overly materialist idea of success, particularly in the context of late 80s Los Angeles.
I will give you muddled messaging there. That's that's as far as I'm willing to
Okay,
go.
okay. I love
Where
that you're
it's
meeting me halfway. It's like,
I'll meet you halfway. Where I could definitely see a writer thinking that, like, oh no, this is, materialistic good. We're shedding it, but I cannot think of a visual metaphor of Holly's independence, of Holly's like working life being respected by John.
okay, well, I think more than that, though, it's respected by the movie, crucially, is the thing, because she's the person who takes the leadership role when Tagaki's killed. She's the one who negotiates with Gruber. She's the one who says, you need to start taking people to the bathroom. I would like to bring out a couch so the pregnant woman can sit on it. Don't worry, she's not expecting. Which is, by the way, I love a great line. It's like, we are one line away from this being a Hallmark Christmas movie. And that line is, don't worry, it's not due for a few months. But I do kind of like, I love that. But she kind of takes charge and she stands up to Gruber. And very much in the sense that like Gruber's arrival is presented as a literal hostile takeover of the business environment, the movie
Mhm.
makes it very clear that Holly is in charge. And indeed, again, at the very end, after everything has been resolved, who is it that punches the reporter? It's not John McClane, stereotypically macho man in his wife beater costume and kind of like 1950s social values. It's
Mhm.
Holly, independent working
Right.
woman in the 1980s. And I mean,
It's
what?
it's Holly who learns that John's stubbornness is what saves the day, so she should learn from John.
And and crucially, through learning that, not be a subservient, conventional, stereotypical 50s housewife. I mean,
Listen.
I feel like the two are incomparable. I feel like you can't really say the movie insists that Holly becomes a stereotypical repressed woman and submissive to John, while also saying she learns to be incredibly stubborn and refusing to compromise, much like John.
No, no, no.
Like
And
one or the
yeah,
other. I feel like you have to pick a lane.
I'm definitely I'm not saying that like the moral of the story is like Holly is should go back to like, making cookies at home or whatever. No, no, definitely
The
not.
kitchen, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
go back to the
Sorry.
kitchen, right? Like what I'm saying here is
So, but
that
John thinks that at the start, though. Like, it's very clear that John is very close to thinking that at the start. Where John's attitude, he may not actually say, you need to be at home raising our kids, but the
Mhm.
impression that he gets and the way in which his conversation with Argyle is played is you are, as an audience, are meant to say, well, look, he probably didn't say it out loud, but he's thinking, well, she's going to fail and she's going to come back and I'm going to be the cop and the
Right.
breadwinner. And I
Right.
think that, like, the movie is structured in such a way that that doesn't happen. That instead, Holly, while she is not as major a character as John is, while she isn't as central a focus, she's
Mhm.
always, I think, respected by the narrative. And I think that by the end, she's respected by John. And I think that like things like her negotiating with Gruber and her punching the reporter are examples of that. And while you could argue that that's just her taking on conventionally stereotypical masculine kind of tropes along the lines of becoming more like
Mhm.
John or echoing John or mirroring John or failing to be her own person, I tend to think it's more along the lines of subverting gender norms and gender expectations.
I am with you that the narrative respects Holly. Like, I totally agree with you as far as like her taking a leadership role. My problem is it's never shown that John does.
That John respects her. Oh yeah,
Right?
you never actually do get to hear him say that he's sorry directly to her. Instead,
He never
he says it abstractly. He says it like, I should have said
right.
I'm sorry. And again, yeah, like again, that's a very logical, and it's worth noting, by the way, the McClane marriage does not necessarily survive the future films in the series, which I think the
Right.
movies deserve credit for. Like, I think the movies like deserve a great deal of credit for saying, look, this unique situation that the couple went through this Christmas Day happened to hold them together for a couple more years. But I
Yeah.
also think it's perfectly reasonable to say that, yeah, even allowing for John McClane's little glimmer of an epiphany in this movie, that's not going to be enough to save them as a couple going forward. And I think that you're right. I think that if you were to argue the Die Hard franchise is a Christmas franchise, I think that's absolute nonsense. I will meet you halfway here. I will say Die Hard is not a Christmas franchise. That I'll give you that. I'm willing to give you that free of charge. I'm willing to say, look, taken as a whole, the Die Hard franchise is not tethered to Christmas in the way that the original and arguably the second one are. I'll give you that. And I think that a large part of that is down to the fact that it realistically looks at the relationship at the end of the first movie and says, this is not a sustainable or healthy dynamic for a husband and wife. And and to be fair, I would also argue that as much as we love the Christmas Prince movies, what little we see of that relationship and dynamic in those movies also may not be entirely healthy in terms of like a long-term relationship outside the conventions of a Christmas movie, which is why, Jack, it is very fortunate that that John and Holly are starring in a Christmas movie in the movie we're talking about today. Where those laws are suspended. Where like the fact that they they don't have the clear communication skills don't matter, you know?
I think
was that too much of a reach?
The hurdles that the Christmas Prince needs to get over is far less than that of John McClane and Holly, where like the Christmas Prince just needs to learn how to not listen to his family for a little bit, right? Yeah,
yeah. Actually listen to his wife, like actually communicate with one another, as opposed to like resent her for having a job. Yeah, that's it.
What I'm gonna go back to is good action movie, bad Christmas movie, where for me a Christmas movie is all about these themes, and the connective tissue in Die Hard isn't there. What I'm trying to think of now is a rewrite now after 40 years, where, for example, John had to like let's say we're in the age of cell phones, right? And John was able to text Holly, or Holly and John were able to communicate in some way where she was giving him like hints and clues, and at first he wasn't listening to her and getting his ass handed to him, and then he starts to realize that, oh, maybe she has some worth here. And that helped him during the action sequences. This is off the top of my head. Obviously, I am no Hollywood screenwriter. But to give Holly more urgency, to give their dynamic more urgency, to have John learn a lesson and show us that he's learned a lesson, besides getting really hurt and being sad on a phone call, I think would go a long way to making this a better Christmas movie.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the fact that it is so unconventional kind of helps it. Like, I think that, and again, you mentioned the fact it's 1988, there are no cell phones. Like, I mean, you could easily imagine a weird alternate version of this starring, like, Michael Douglas and Sharon Stone, in which Holly just happens to be arguing with John when the terrorists arrive. And so the two of them end up die-harding together, and then they have to, like, bond over the course of it. But that's a very, very different movie. And I think that you don't get that same journey for John in particular. And I think like that's what I think is important here in terms of Die Hard, in that like Holly doesn't need to change. Holly is fine as she is. It's John. John is the problem here. John needs to have that like Christmas epiphany. John needs to like confront the Grinch. And again, we didn't talk about Hans too much, but let's just say, Hans arrives and he's in charge of the Christmas party, and he's got a beard. He's not entirely jolly, but he's planned everything out. Like the guy who was born at Christmas, he initially has 12 henchmen to help him out. And, he's initially seems like what he's trying to do is he's trying to get boys and girls to go home for Christmas. And it eventually turns out, no, what he's actually trying to do is he's trying to steal Christmas. He has not learned the true spirit of the holiday, and Hans just wants to take money for himself. He's like the Grinch going into somebody else's house and just taking all of their presents away and ruining their Christmas party. At which point, John, who has been like the Grinch throughout this, he's been antagonistic towards Holly. And in fact, he openly acknowledges, stupid, that was stupid, he says, after he has that really silly argument about her changing her name. He shows up, he ruins Christmas, he rains on everybody's parade, he's just a killjoy all around, and then when it turns out that Hans is not there to save Christmas, but Hans is there to steal Christmas, John has to move into that role. And I think that that's the difference here between what you and I are suggesting. I think you think that like John and Holly need to make a journey together. I think that John needs to make a journey to catch up with Holly. I think that John needs to realize what he has. I think John needs to accept that things are not what he wants them to be, but that's okay because he can still, grow as a person.
Oh, no, and I agree with you, and that is what I'm saying, and I'm saying that that's not
Okay.
what they showed us. And so I was trying
Oh,
to imagine a world in which
okay.
Holly was involved more with John's character growth, because as far as I see, John has no character growth within Die Hard. So I want there to be growth, you know.
Oh yeah.
It,
I
that's
think
what
he
I'm saying.
experiences. I think he experiences Christmas character growth, which is, let's be very, very generous here and assume that maybe if he can take everything that he learns over the course of this movie, everything that he pours out during the dark night of the soul that he's suffering through, and if he finds a way to internalize that in the spirit of the season, he might somehow end up a better person now coming out the other end. And most Christmas movies rely on us going, okay, yes, sure, a person can change if they have a unique experience. If Scrooge is visited by the three ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future,
Mhm.
maybe after God knows how many years of being a miser, he can turn his life around. And maybe in the spirit of the season watching Die Hard, we're expected to believe that if John McClane is visited by just one terrorist of Christmas present, then maybe he can also turn himself around. And I do agree that it is drawn rather broadly and rather vaguely, and I do agree that, it doesn't necessarily hit all of the kind of hallmark beats that you would expect from that journey. I think it is clear enough. And I think that, like, it being a Christmas movie, and this is one of the things where it's a self-proving fallacy, where it's able to say, instead of saying it does X, therefore it's a Christmas movie, I instead say it's a Christmas movie, so it does X. So if it's a Christmas movie, we generally accept that its themes are drawn a bit more broadly, they're a bit more overtly stated, and again, part of that is down to the fact that it's aimed at a broader audience. Part of it's down to the fact that it assumes that you are watching it in the spirit of the season, which is one of charity and forgiveness, and part of it is also down to the fact that it is designed to be consumed by people watching it on Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, or on St. Stephen's Day, which is gorged on mince pies, in some sort of sugar-related coma, possibly either
Mm.
nursing or developing a hangover that will haunt them through the Christmas season. And therefore,
Yeah.
instead of having subtly seated and carefully developed character growths and arcs that stretch from scene to scene, and which are graphable and chartable, instead it literally has characters come out and state the character arc that they are going through. And I think that that is precisely what John McClane does when he has that conversation. He says, hey,
Mm.
this is a Christmas movie. You know why this is a Christmas movie? Because I'm going to tell you some Christmassy themes. And, like, I think that Willis
Mm.
is good enough in that scene that it works. Like, and again, I'm willing to admit I am totally hosing it there, that the entire logic of that argument falls down if you look at the fact that instead of saying X proves it's a Christmas movie allows it to do X, but I'm going to stick with it.
And I think that's absolutely fair, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. If you
Yeah.
like watching it during a Christmas time, if you can make those connections, which I believe to be rather tenuous, good for you. Anything that brings you joy is worthwhile. And
Yes.
that's the real Christmas miracle. What?
That was. I like it. I like it. I like that somehow Jack's like, you know what? Die Hard doesn't hit its Christmas messaging hard enough, and then he's like, watch me line this up and bring it in.
It's
Christmas.
all right. It's on the tee and whiffed.
Yeah.
Oh, it was right there, and I whiffed it
It's
because I'm bad at
it's
outros.
it's it's okay, listeners. Listeners heard Jack say, Die Hard was never a Christmas movie 1,000 times, but they never heard him say, it's a Christmas movie once. Nah, I don't think that works either. Um, but yes, no,
Ooh.
I agree entirely with the sentiment. Christmas is what you make of it, and
Mm.
particularly this year. And I mean, in general, the idea of Christmas, or at least in my experience of Christmas, is that a Christmas tradition is something that can be both broad and widely agreed. Like,
Mm.
most people would agree that Die Hard is a Christmas movie. That is actually a lie. Most people do not specifically agree that Die Hard is a Christmas movie, but that's okay because people are allowed to be wrong. But people can agree that things are Christmassy and that that's what makes them. So, like chestnuts roasting on open fire, making snowmen, and things like that. But I think that also anybody who has enjoyed a Christmas with their extended family will realize that there are things particular to those families that they associate with Christmas. Whether it's
Mm.
the baking of particular kind of pastry treats, whether it's the way in which particular dishes are seasoned, whether it's the arguments that happen incessantly the same years over and over again, on schedule like clockwork. It doesn't matter what it is, if it makes you feel like Christmas, I think it is. And I would argue that Die Hard should do that. And it certainly does for me. And in the end, I think I'm the only one who matters. So yeah.
You nailed it, Dan.
I know, somehow even worse than Jack's outro. But no. More seriously, watch Die Hard. Watch Die Hard if you want to.
Honestly.
Don't watch it if you don't. Watch
Yeah.
whatever you want to watch. It's Christmas. If you want to watch like L.A. Confidential, watch it. If you want to watch It's a Wonderful Life, watch it. If you want to watch Citizen Kane, which is arguably a Christmas movie because it's very much about a man reflecting on how he wasted his life and how nothing really matters, and there's some snow in it and a snow globe and a sled is very important in terms of plot. Yeah, sure, watch that. That's kind of a Christmas movie as well, I guess.
Freaking
Yeah.
No, and you know what? Watch Die Hard. It's such a great movie. It's just a great action movie.
Yeah. And
But
a great
yeah.
Christmas movie.
Fuck.
You're never getting out, Jack. You are never like I know that Jack controls the edit, but he is never getting out of here.
No, and that's fair. And you know what? In the theme of reflecting on the joy, thank you so much, Darren, for having this conversation, which did not get heated at all.
Actually didn't, which and
No.
not just because it's December. And like no, thank you very much, Jack, as well. Like again, it's been a wonderful couple of years. Well, not wonderful couple of years, wonderful couple of months actually doing this as well with yourself and with all the guests that we've had, and very much to be honest, thank you for the listeners. We've had some really good engagement in the comments below. Feedback is I think people have been generally welcoming, particularly when I pronounce words weird, which I really appreciate. Somebody who pronounces words weird on a regular basis, and I'd just thank you for spending time with us. Actually, thank you for listening to us, and we really appreciate it. And we're glad, like I'm really glad that I get to do this. I'm really glad that I get to talk movies and nonsense with Jack and everybody else roughly once a week. And I'm glad that people enjoy it, and I hope that you continue to. So thank you very much. And in the spirit of the season, a happy St. Stephen's Day for our Irish listeners, a happy Boxing Day for everybody else. And remember, servants need Christmas presents too.
It's true. It's true, I guess.
I didn't know about that until I read it. It was a thing
amazing.
that actually existed. It really is. It's so Dickensian. It's fantastic. it's like what do you imagine Scrooge did the day after Christmas? Boxing Day.
Of course. Oh, that's beautiful. No, that's beautiful. All right, that's beautiful. That's where we're ending. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Happy Christmas.